afternoon. I'm Lisa Washington Thomas, the Director of the TANF Technical Assistance and Special Initiatives Division in the Office of Family Assistance, and I want to welcome you to the TANF and Child Welfare Collaboration, Preventative Strategies focused on family well-being and a review of the evidence and implications for practice. I am a proud member of the Office of Family Assistance employee, and OFA, in partnership with the Children's Bureau, is hosting this webinar to feature research conducted and reviewed by Chapin Hall researchers regarding economic stability, family well-being, and its relevance and applicability to child welfare prevention, specifically focusing on the collaboration between TANF and child welfare agencies in developing preventative strategies and innovative practice modules. This webinar will highlight research findings contributing to the current knowledge base. It will also describe the policy options and innovations introduced by states to bolster family economic security and protect children. And it will identify pain points and key challenges to collaboration and coordination derived from research and practice. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to let you know that the slides from today's webinar will be available on the PeerTA website when the webinar has completed the 508 process, as well as at the end of the webinar, there's an interest form. And if you want the slides more quickly than the posting, you can put your contact information there, and our wonderful colleagues at BLH and Mathematica will send them to you. It is my pleasure to present to you three wonderful researchers from Chapin Hall who will be providing information today. The first is Claire Anderson. She is a senior policy fellow at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. Ms. Anderson engages child welfare agencies, stakeholders, and constituents in a large-scale system change, and is a national thought leader on economic supports as core to prevention of child welfare involvement. Prior to joining Chapin Hall, Ms. Anderson was one of our colleagues at ACF. She was Deputy Commissioner at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where we work, and the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families. Dr. Krista Thomas is a senior policy fellow at Chapin Hall. Dr. Thomas leads blended teams of policy, practice, and research experts in efforts to build the capacity of state and local human service systems across the country to execute large-scale reform initiatives and improve outcomes for vulnerable children and families. And Yasmin Gural-Clark is a senior policy analyst at Chapin Hall. Her work focuses on supporting large-scale systems change efforts to positively impact the lives of children and their families. She provides research-driven implementation and capacity-building assistance to local and state child welfare agencies across the country, and is currently guiding several jurisdictions in their planning, readiness, and implementation of the Family First Prevention Services Act. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and I will turn this over to Claire Anderson.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today. I am Claire Anderson, and my colleagues Krista Thomas and Yasmin Grewal-Koch. We are delighted to be in thought partnership with you at the intersection of TANF and child welfare, particularly as it relates to preventing involvement with child protective services. We will be talking swiftly today. We have a fair amount of content, probably more than is reasonable for a 1-hour webinar, but there's a story arc here, and we want to try and at least give you a feel for the policy history, the evidence of economic and concrete supports, and the implications of that. And so we will do a fair amount of toggling back and forth, as Lisa indicated, between the evidence of economic and concrete supports and state policy options. As I said, we will move rather swiftly. The slides for today specifically will be available, as Lisa indicated. We also have a broader deck that you can view at your leisure at this website and QR code. So that is available to you today. So I'm going to start with a little bit of the historical and contemporary policy context, specifically as it relates to child welfare, but then a bit more broadly about the human service sector and our social safety net more generally. It's important to understand that from the very beginning of the origins of the child welfare system, that services and supports to stabilize families economically were separated or bifurcated from services and supports designed to keep children safe. And that fundamental design flaw remains with us today. Economic and concrete support policies were administered completely as if they were unrelated to child welfare. And what we hope to show you today is evidence showing that, in fact, they are quite directly related, and that the relationship between economic and concrete supports and involvement with child welfare is much closer than our originating policy framework suggests. So our historical policy choices really sort of center economic hardship. We're going to start with economic hardship. And our human service system and safety net is designed to buffer and ensure that the government's more intrusive or intensive interventions are not deployed. But we do have fragmentation and deficit-based piecemeal policies overlaid with mandated reporting law requirements, such that any mandated reporter is to report any suspicion of abuse or neglect, meaning that many families are funneled to child welfare to meet unaddressed needs that are elevating risk, rather than orienting a system that's designed to ensure that families have sufficient economic and concrete supports to meet their needs. As a result, many families become overloaded and destabilized. We'll talk a fair amount about economic shocks in the lives of families and how destabilizing and risk elevating those can be. A fair amount of unmet service and support needs, high rates of reported neglect, and then the deployment of the government's authority to investigate and remove children from their families and extended or extensive child welfare system involvement in this country. So we're going to shift from our policy context, but it's important to keep that in mind, to a bit of an overview of family economic insecurity, income, and child welfare involvement. We know that 60% or slightly more of substantiated CPS responses in this country involve neglect only. But the evidence that you'll see today shows that the provision of economic and concrete supports is associated with decreased risk for both neglect and physical abuse. It's also important here to note that in this box of CPS responses, we also understand that there is a great deal of substance use challenges, mental health challenges, domestic violence. But what you'll see is that economic and concrete supports are seemingly having an effect regardless of what is in this box. So it's important to have a real nuanced understanding of the relationship of economic and concrete supports to abuse and neglect, as well as ensuring that we are thinking about meeting family needs to buffer the more complex needs that they have that are elevating risk. Because we know that 85% of families investigated by Child Protective Services have incomes below 200% of the federal poverty line. So this is, in essence, a government intervention that is pointed predominantly at families with limited resources. And families that have substance abuse or mental health or domestic violence challenges that have sufficient resources are buffered more sufficiently and do not have Child Protective Services at this level in their lives. We also know that almost 70% of families with income below 200% of the poverty line experience a material hardship in the past year, and that includes difficulty paying for housing, utilities, food, medical care. And of these families, about 61% experience a financial shock in the past year. And you'll see as we go through the evidence that these financial shocks can be quite destabilizing in the lives of families and important for us to understand, particularly as we are trying to prevent involvement with Child Protective Services, what we should be looking for, or what we could be looking for to help families buffer these shocks in their lives. This Yang study from 2015 looked at a population of families who are receiving TANF and found that if these low-income families experience at least one material hardship, their likelihood of a neglect investigation and a physical abuse investigation rose. Importantly, if they experienced multiple types of material hardships after experiencing no hardships, there was a 4 times higher likelihood of a CPS investigation and a 7 times higher likelihood of a physical abuse investigation. We're also getting much better at understanding the predictors of involvement with child welfare. On the right-hand side in the darker blue boxes, we see the strongest predictors of investigated neglect reports, food pantry use, cutting meals, so food insecurity, housing insecurity, including short duration of residence, difficulty paying rent, utility shutoffs, inability to receive medical care for a sick family member. Public benefit receipt is very interesting. What you'll see throughout this presentation is that public benefit receipt can actually be quite buffering. We think that it might be a predictor from a spotlight standpoint. More families are interacting with more mandated reporters. So we have a number of hypotheses here, given the mixed evidence on public benefit receipt. And on the left-hand side, we see the most reliable economic predictors of child welfare involvement: income loss. So this economic shock or income shock in the life of family, cumulative material hardships, and housing hardship. So if you drill down, this is an important study from 2021 looking specifically at negative earning shocks. And they found that low-income families with recently closed CPS investigations, if they experience a negative earning shock of averaging about a quarterly reduction in earnings of 30% more or more, there was an increased risk of a subsequent CPS investigation by 18%, and an increased risk of physical abuse investigation by 26%. And each additional negative earning shock is associated with a 15% greater likelihood of CPS involvement. So again, understanding what's happening in the lives of families when earning shocks are occurring relative to CPS involvement. Importantly, each consecutive quarter where the family had stable income was associated with a 5% lower risk of a CPS investigation. And in this study, we found that accessing sufficient public benefits when families experience a shock effectively buffers against the risk of child welfare system involvement. And the buffering is particularly strong for families with young children who we know come to the attention of child welfare, enter child welfare, and are in child welfare and foster care at a greater rate than other children. We see a 50% decrease in risk for physical abuse investigation in this buffering effect. This may be among the most important slides that we'll share with you today. This study looked at mothers who were participating in TANF and were eligible to receive full child support for their children, and the child support was disregarded in determining welfare benefits. They were found to be 10% less likely to have a child subject to a screened-in maltreatment report. And in this randomized control trial, even a modest increase in child support payments, averaging about $100 per year, resulted in a decrease in screened-in maltreatment reports. So what's a state policy option? So here we're starting to toggle between the evidence and the policy options, allowing a full pass-through of child support for TANF participants. And we see Michigan doing that as part of its budget, including a full pass-through of monthly child support payments for current TANF participants and allowing participants to keep 100% of their child support payments. I've been talking thus far about prevention. It's also important to talk about reunification, in part because we find that this evidence is stable across time, many studies over the last 20 years or more, and across family involvement with child welfare in prevention and in foster care as well. Children in foster care take longer to reunify when their families have reduced income. And we find this last bullet, families who are required to pay the state for the cost of foster care, a $100 increase in the monthly child support order amount predicted a delay of reunification by over 6 months. So what's a state policy option? Allowing families to continue cash assistance for families that are working to reunify. We find that Oklahoma has recently created a policy that allows parents who receive TANF benefits when their children are placed in foster care to continue to be eligible for those monthly cash assistance for up to 4 months when they're actively working to reunify. We know that ACF has recently released guidance recommending that states limit billing parents for the cost of foster care. And this quote out to the side says, it's likely that reducing the income of a child's parents could impede their ability to engage in reunification efforts, potentially extending the time a child spends in foster care. So we're going to look a little bit at context and drivers of economic insecurity and child welfare system involvement. Again, with sort of these shocks or instability in the lives of families economically, we know that economic insecurity is widespread. There are far more families who will experience risk related to both poverty and child welfare involvement than I think is commonly understood. And families are moving in and out of poverty over time. And we think that this volatility and turbulence that's created by entering and leaving poverty is creating serious stress for families and is likely impacting parenting. This study from our colleague Emma Monahan at Chapin Hall looks specifically at income instability and found increased risk for CPS investigations similar to the previous studies I've shared with you. In this, she controlled for household income level and found that there is likely a unique relationship between income instability, this volatility, and child welfare system involvement. We think that this volatility fits nicely or is explained well through the family stress model, leading to child welfare system involvement that takes us from an economic and material hardship through psychological distress, drained mental resources, inability to really concentrate on the things that matter in terms of running a household and managing nurturing, responsive, supportive parenting relationships, thereby increasing risk for child welfare system involvement. And we like to think about this as sort of an overloaded metaphor. The boxes that you see here are the same boxes you saw earlier in terms of predictors of child welfare system involvement being loaded onto a truck. If you have a truck that has a payload of 4,000 pounds, but you put 5,000 pounds on the truck is not going to operate intended as designed. And so families do and can become overloaded and not able to function. And so part of what we hope to share with you today are ways in which states can make policy choices that offload some of this risk or create context in which families can be successful. The WHO, the World Health Organization, took many of these concepts and laid them out quite elegantly. And it's a complex model, and I'm not going to walk you through all of it. But it's important to note that they were looking at the adverse childhood experiences and social determinants of health. And they found that if we look only at the behavioral and biological and psychosocial factors, which is what we tend to do, we look at the most proximal thing, the most pathological thing that's happening in a family, and we try and fix it. And what they found was that in looking at social determinants of health, we cannot limit ourselves to these intermediary determinants, but we also must include and must think of our broader policy and contextual situation as equal area of intervention, that we have to tackle the underlying structural determinants. And those are on the far left, our social, economic, and political context in terms of governance, our macroeconomic policies, our social policies, our public policies, and our cultural and societal values. That if you walk away with nothing more here today, it's really understanding that an individual's needs are situated in context, and we must understand and address context as well. This very recent analysis out this year helps to bring this to the fore. Jessica Pack and her colleagues took the National Academy of Sciences roadmap for reducing child poverty and modeled the different packages to see what might happen in terms of child welfare system involvement. And they found that package 2, 3, and 4, if implemented, could result in reduced CPS investigations between 11 and 20% annually. Importantly, they found that these packages potentially could have a differential effect in reducing racial disproportionality in involvement with child protective services, because they found it's not 11 to 20%. It is for Black children specifically 19 to almost 30% reductions in CPS involvement. And this, I would say, is among the most important sentences of this report and perhaps of a number of studies over the last 5 or so years. And so I'm actually going to read it to you because I think it's so important. Reports alleging child maltreatment, and particularly child neglect, are disproportionately common among low-income families, and existing research suggests that this link is only partially attributable to parental characteristics, suggesting that substantial resource constraints lead directly to an increased likelihood of CPS involvement. Okay, so we're going to take that last finding from her as it relates to a potential differential effect for Black and Brown families, and think about economic and concrete supports for a moment as a specific race equity strategy to address disparity and disproportionality in child welfare. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. We know that poverty and economic hardship put families at increased risk of child welfare system involvement. And due to systemic inequities, families of color are more likely to experience economic hardship and income and employment volatility. And economic and concrete supports can help stabilize families and prevent child welfare involvement, which may be a mechanism to reduce racial disparities. So as we think about why that might be, it's important to understand that current and historic systemic inequities put families of color at disproportionate risk of economic hardship. And this is a list that we've pulled from a California task force report looking at the variety of ways in which economic and concrete supports are not distributed equitably in the US. We also know that children and families of color are more likely to experience poverty. And importantly, as we were talking earlier about economic shocks, there's really very little buffer in Black families economically to weather those economic shocks. The median net worth in 2019 dollars for white families is almost $190,000. But for Black families, that median net worth is a little less than $25,000. And it's not too much of a leap then to view these data in a way that helps us understand that we are deploying Child Protective Services in a way that relates to a set of policy choices that we are making. Over half of all Black children experience an investigation by the time they turn age 18 in the US. So Child Protective Services is engaged with over half of Black children. Importantly, it's engaged with almost 40% of all children. And so we hope that what you see today are policy options that can help us reduce the deployment when it is unnecessary in the lives of families of Child Protective Services and create a different policy context and a different set of strategies to intervene and be supportive and family strengthening. We know that there's a recent executive order on advancing race equity and support for underserved communities. And the federal government, consistent with all applicable law, should allocate resources to address the historic failure to invest sufficiently, justly, and equally in underserved communities, as well as individuals from those communities. So when we look at this prior slide in this context, I hope that this executive order takes on a specific meaning for ways in which we can be deploying our policies and our resources differently than we do today. So I am going to just talk very briefly about the evidence and our framing for the evidence, and then turn it over to Yasmin. We really see a preponderance of evidence over time that informs our understanding of what's been effective and why, and our hypotheses of potential policy shifts. We have a number of different studies here. We have a very few number of randomized controlled trials that really are the gold standard that help us understand causality. And then we have decades of administrative data aligned with policy or other shifts, natural experiments when one state takes up a policy option and the others do not. And then we've presented a number of theoretical models for us to talk through today. And when we say economic and concrete supports, we really mean very broadly a variety of ways in which families receive, can access, can make use of economic and concrete supports in their lives. Everything from cash assistance to employment to food and clothing. And we're going to talk a bit about TANF and child welfare specifically, and it's a real pleasure to bring the past to the fore. In 2003, there was a bold new vision created by Dave Burns and his colleagues in El Paso County, Colorado, and then taken to Arizona to the Department of Economic Security, which was a TANF and child welfare agency at the time. And this is a brief written about that bold new vision by CLASP back in 2003. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, under Dave Burns' leadership, considers itself a child abuse and neglect prevention program, while the child welfare program considers itself an anti-poverty program. It was great fun to train their integrated units in Arizona and see this approach begin to take life. We see in Vermont a contemporary 2023 way in which that is coming to life. Vermont has the highest rate of child maltreatment referrals in the nation, but the lowest rate of screened-in neglect cases. They've created an economic firewall and interagency collaboration and service coordination. Families are provided flexible funds, and they have a multidimensional diversion program that refers families to TANF, to family resource centers, and to a differential response so that they're able to keep screened-in neglect cases very low. So state policy options. In the context of our conversation today at the intersection of TANF and child welfare, it's important to remember that the first statutory goal of TANF is to support needy families so that children can remain safely at home or with relatives. So statutorily, TANF really is designed as our primary prevention strategy. And so how it is implemented, the extent to which a state takes up this first statutory goal, they have an option to do so. And in the relationship between child welfare and TANF, understanding how to organize or how to think together about this first statutory goal in any particular state is important. States also have the option to retain dollars in an emergency fund. Some states retain $0, and some states retain a fair amount of dollars. Up to $1.2 billion, I think, is the highest emergency fund at this point. But given the first statutory goal and dollars being unspent in TANF, being held in reserve, thinking through the ways in which states together, child welfare and TANF, can make decisions about the first statutory goal and the dollars in reserve is important. So I'm going to turn this over to Yasmin, who's going to walk us through evidence of what happens when access to TANF specifically is reduced.
Thanks so much, Claire. Good afternoon, everyone. So let's look at the TANF research. This 2017 study examined the effect of TANF policy changes and benefit restrictions from 2004 to 2015 on child abuse and neglect reports, substantiations, and foster care placement. It found that states that implemented total benefit loss as the most severe sanction for not meeting TANF work requirements saw a 23% increase in substantiated neglect reports, a 13% increase in foster care entries due to neglect, and about a 13% increase in total foster care entries. Let's turn to the next slide. States have considerable flexibility in administering their TANF programs. A state policy option to consider that's aligned with the research I just shared is to eliminate full family sanctions. Full family sanctions take away TANF benefits from the entire family if a parent does not meet work requirements. This map shows that nearly half of states currently impose full family sanctions as an initial sanction for non-compliance with TANF work requirements. I also want to point out that states with higher concentrations of Black residents have a higher likelihood of imposing full family sanctions. Let's go to the next slide. Oregon recently eliminated full family sanctions. They did this by assigning 75% of the monthly TANF cash grant to dependent children and preventing sanctions from being applied to that amount. Their policy change acknowledges the first statutory goal of TANF that Claire highlighted and recognizes that moving away from full family sanctions can help to keep children at home and with their families. The study I previously shared from 2017 also found that states that implemented TANF time limits of less than 5 years saw a 34% increase in substantiated maltreatment reports and a 37% increase in neglect reports. This slide highlights the state policy option of extending TANF time limits to 60 months, which is the federal maximum lifetime limit. Rhode Island recently extended the total time that TANF participants can receive cash assistance from 48 to 60 months. The authors of the 2017 study I just shared followed up with this recently published study. It found that each additional state policy that restricts access to TANF is associated with an additional 50 children with substantiated neglect reports, 22 children entering foster care due to abuse, and 21 children entering foster care due to neglect. And those are all per 100,000 children. The box on the right describes the specific TANF policy choices that this study considered. They included time limits, sanctions, work requirements for mothers with young children, and suspicion-based drug testing of applicants. Let's go to the next slide. This is another recent TANF study. It found that state policies that reduce the maximum allowable cash benefit amount, that implement stricter time limits, and that result in lower TANF to poverty ratios, and that means there's less access to TANF benefits. All of those are associated with increases in mothers' self-reports of physical child maltreatment. This interesting analysis found that reductions in AFDC and later TANF cash benefit levels were a main predictor of the dramatic growth in state-level foster care caseloads from 1985 to 2000. It estimated that during this time period, a 10% reduction in the average monthly TANF cash benefit amount for a family of 3 was associated with a 2.3% increase in the foster care caseload. Now, what does the evidence suggest happens when access to TANF is increased? Let's turn to the next slide. This seminal study looked at state-level data on public benefit levels from 1990 to 1998 to examine the impact of welfare reforms on several measures of child maltreatment. It found that more generous welfare benefits are associated with fewer children placed into foster care. And it specifically found that a 10% increase in state public benefit levels, here it was AFDC plus the value of food stamps, for a family of 4 is predicted to reduce foster care placements by 8%. Let's go to the next slide. States have the option of increasing TANF spending on cash assistance for families. As you can see from the graphic on this slide, today, most states spend only a small percentage of their TANF funds on cash assistance. In fact, total TANF spending on cash assistance has declined by 69% since TANF's first year when adjusting for inflation. Currently, 15 states spend less than 10% of their TANF funds on cash assistance, and 41% of Black children live in states that spend less than 10% of their TANF funds on basic assistance. If you click on the link on this slide, you'll be able to see how your state spends its TANF dollars. Let's go to the next slide. Returning to one of the recent TANF studies I previously shared, it found that easing TANF restrictions is associated with fewer children with substantiated neglect and fewer children placed into foster care. It estimated that around 29,000 fewer children would have entered foster care nationally from 2004 to 2016 if states had eased TANF restrictions to increase access for families. State policies that increase access to TANF are also associated with reductions in maternal self-reported physical child maltreatment. For example, this study found that a $100 increase in TANF cash benefits is associated with reductions in mothers' self-reported physical child maltreatment. Let's go to the next slide. Based on the research we've shared today, increasing TANF cash assistance benefit amounts may be an important state policy option to reduce family child welfare involvement. TANF cash benefit amounts are determined solely by states. This map shows the maximum monthly cash benefits amounts for single parent families with 1 child as of 2020. You can see that the maximum monthly amount varies significantly across the states. Turning to that blue box on the right, it's important to point out that currently only 2 states have a maximum benefit amount that is at or greater than 50% of the federal poverty line. Although several states did increase their TANF cash assistance amounts in 2021, the benefits in most states remain at their lowest value since the program was created in 1996. And 48% of Black children live in states with TANF cash assistance amounts below 20% of the federal poverty line, compared to 35% of white children. Now I'll pass it to my colleague, Dr. Krista Thomas, to share what the evidence suggests happens when other economic and concrete supports are reduced.
Thanks, Yasmin, and thank you for that really valuable information about TANF. And I'm going to talk about other economic and concrete supports. And skipping right to the punchline from the onset, when you look at a range of studies, there is a pretty strong preponderance of evidence that decreasing access to economic and concrete supports, operationalized as supports like lack of childcare, lack of stable housing, increased gas prices, reduced employment, negative earning shocks, reduced income, these types of decreased access result in increased risk of child welfare system involvement. Childcare is an incredibly important lever in this conversation. And reducing access to childcare is shown to have worsened child welfare outcomes. When you look at the Yang study, which looked at predictors of child welfare, of child neglect, Yang and colleagues found that for every child care concern reported by families receiving TANF, their risk of supervisory child neglect went up by 20%. A slightly older study, but still incredibly important to point to, is the Cash and colleagues study from back in 2003, who found that mothers that were entering substance use treatment who had difficulty securing childcare were 82% more likely than mothers who did not have this difficulty to self-report child neglect. In fact, that difficulty finding childcare in this study was a stronger predictor of maternal neglect than almost any other factor included in the study, including mental health and severity of drug use. Housing stress cannot be understated, and it's exciting to share some findings from this relatively recent systematic review conducted by Chandler and colleagues, published in 2022. They were looking at elements of housing stress operationalized by factors like homelessness, eviction, foreclosure filing, housing instability, multiple moves, inadequate housing. That factors such as these were associated in this meta-analysis with increased likelihood of child welfare involvement, operationalized as outcomes like caregiver self-reported child maltreatment, CPS investigations, substantiated CPS reports, and foster care placement. And before moving on, I wanted to point your attention to the box on the left of this slide that shows that families with children make up almost 1/3 of the total percentage of the population experiencing homelessness in the US. And 1 of 3 children who are homeless have experienced a major mental disorder by the time they reach age 8. Housing insecurity, looking at things like mortgage delinquencies and foreclosures, have also been shown to be increased with negative child welfare system involvement. For example, increases in hospital admissions for physical abuse of children under the age of 6, and traumatic brain injury for infants less than a year of age. And we're talking about non-birth and non-motor vehicle crash-related traumatic brain injury in this case. So, right, if we think about all the negative things that happen when we reduce access to economic and concrete supports, what might the evidence base show happens when we increase access to economic and concrete supports? I bet you can see where this is going to go in this story. When we're thinking about increasing access to economic and concrete supports, by and large, is associated with decreased risk for child welfare system involvement. And I'm talking about supports like macroeconomic social policies like the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, employment policies like increased minimum wage, paid family leave, unemployment benefits, concrete supports like childcare, housing, healthcare coverage, child welfare interventions that have economic and concrete supports components, like family preservation programs that have a financial component associated with them, and as well as public benefits like overall spending, TANF program, SNAP, and and going back to many of the policies that Yasmin was talking about earlier. And we're going to dig into much of this in a bit more detail. Well, it's helpful to think about the family investment model in terms of a theoretical framework that helps us understand how and why economic and concrete supports might positively impact child and family well-being. Oh, I'm seeing a note about speaking up. Can folks hear me? Can folks hear me okay? I'm looking at those I can see. I see thumbs up over there. I will do better. So looking at the family investment model is a helpful way to organize our thinking about how economic and concrete supports can positively impact child and family well-being. Right. So if we think about families receiving sufficient economic and concrete supports to meet their basic needs, well, then they're going to have the capacity to meet the needs of their families and their children. If we're able to meet these needs, and families are going to be in a better position to be able to invest in services and opportunities that would benefit their families and their children's health and development. And families that have access to important resources like sufficient housing, childcare so they can get to work, educational opportunities to promote the academic development and cognitive development of their children, which puts them in a position where families can provide increased nurturing and responsive and supportive parenting because they're not experiencing many of the stressors that we were talking about earlier, which results in family environments where the families and the children are experiencing improved well-being, which leads us to a space where we've got much lower risk for child welfare system involvement in many of the negative outcomes that we were talking about earlier. So it's just a helpful way to kind of organize thinking. It's also helpful to think about economic and concrete supports as a population level strategy for preventing child maltreatment. And I'm not talking about the unique or discrete benefits of any individual program, but looking holistically at how much jurisdictions invest in benefit programs for each individual living in poverty. And in this slide, I'm talking about public benefit programs that include examples like cash housing and in-kind cash assistance, low-income housing development, childcare assistance, refundable earned income tax credits, and medical assistance like Medicaid and CHIP. And the Pools, really exciting analysis by Pools and colleagues demonstrated that for each additional $1,000 that jurisdictions spent annually on public benefit programs per person living in poverty was shown to be associated with a 4% reduction in maltreatment reports, a 4% reduction in substantiated maltreatment, a 2% reduction in foster care placements, and an 8% reduction in child fatalities due to maltreatment. And all of these findings were independent of federal spending in these areas. So that kind of encourages us to take a look at your state data and take a look at the level and mix that jurisdictions are spending on public benefits per person living in poverty. This chart shows states' total annualized spending on public benefits per person living in poverty, spanning the years of fiscal years 2010 through 2017. Apologize, it's a little hard to see, but you can see there's quite variation across the country, and there is quite ample opportunity to increase the level and mix of state spending in these public benefit programs. The Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit represent incredibly important macroeconomic policy levers that have the ability to improve child welfare outcomes. This study shows that the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit payments were shown to result in immediate reductions in state-level child maltreatment reports. In fact, for each $1,000 in per child EITC and CTC refunds was shown to be associated with a decline in state-level maltreatment reports of 2.3% in the week of pay in the actual week of payment, and over 7%, almost 8% reduction in maltreatment reports within the 4 weeks of disbursement. This slide speaks to the benefits of refundable earned income tax credits. So refundable meaning that the recipients are able to get the full benefit of their tax credit, even if it exceeds their tax liability. So that's the difference between refundable and non-refundable tax credits. States that have a state level refundable EITC compared to those that don't are shown to have an 11% decrease in foster care entries, even after controlling for variables like poverty, race, education, and unemployment. Refundable state level earned income tax credit, which averages about $400 per year, is shown to be associated with a 13% decrease in hospital admissions for abuse of head trauma for kids under 2 years of age. So important policy levers to think about the benefits of these earned income tax credit, and taking a look at what that looks like around the country. As of August of 2022, there were 26 states, the District of Columbia, Guam, and Puerto Rico, that have implemented a refundable earned income tax credit within their jurisdiction. And there's still quite a few states that have not adopted an EITC, and some states that also have a refundable, non-refundable, or both earned income tax credit. But so just something to take a look at within your jurisdictions. Minimum wage is another policy lever that is shown to improve child welfare outcomes. From 2004 to 2013, states that increased their minimum wage beyond the federal rate of $7.25 per hour experienced a decrease in their child maltreatment reports. And for every $1 increase in state level minimum wage is associated with a 9.6% decline in child neglect reports. And this is especially powerful for children under 12 years of age. So another thing to take a look at across the country and within your own jurisdictions is what your minimum wage laws are or could be. As of January of this year, there were 18 states plus the District of Columbia that have adopted minimum wage laws of $12 per hour. And it's important to note that the current federal minimum wage is worth less now in 2023 than at any point since 1956. Paid family leave, another important policy lever that has the opportunity to benefit child welfare outcomes. The Chapin study looked at the impact of the California paid family leave policy established in 2004. And this is a longitudinal study that was looking at the impact of the paid family leave policy on hospital admissions for abuse of head trauma. And they found that the paid family leave policy was associated with a decrease over the longitudinal period of the study was associated with a decrease in hospital admissions for head trauma among kids less than a year old and among children less than 2 years old. Paid family leave is still a social policy option where there is lots of opportunity across the country to look at this differently. At this point in time, less than 1 in 4 workers across the country have access to paid family leave. And 11 states plus DC have adopted a statewide paid family leave program, but importantly, only 7 states have adopted and fully implemented paid family leave, looking at things like a minimum of 6 weeks of coverage following the birth, adoption, or placement of child into foster care. So lots of room for improvement in this area. The intersection between Medicaid and child welfare is a really important relationship to take a look at. Medicaid expansion is, in addition to addressing health outcomes, is also associated with improved economic stability and mental health for parents that are low income. And it also has shown to have a benefit on child welfare outcomes. Specifically, Brown and colleagues showed that the rate of screened-in neglect reports for children under the age of 6 decreased in states that chose to expand Medicaid, but it increased in states that did not expand Medicaid, looking at the years between 2013 and 2016. Moreover, they did some additional modeling, and their findings demonstrated that if the non-expansion states had chosen to expand Medicaid, their findings indicated that we would have seen almost 125,000 fewer screened in neglect reports for children under the age of 6 for about the same time period. In addition to thinking about Medicaid with child welfare outcomes and mental health, there's also an important relationship between Medicaid expansion and housing instability. Because we think about providing families with financial protection against high medical bills can also free up additional income to pay rent, avoid eviction, or address other housing needs. In states that chose to expand Medicaid, this study shows that their evictions fell by 20% compared to their counterparts that did not choose to expand their Medicaid funds. I think there's really exciting to be looking at the creative and innovative things that a number of jurisdictions are looking to implement through their 1115 waivers. North Carolina, California, Oregon are all jurisdictions to take a look at as they're thinking about how to leverage their Medicaid funding to address social determinants of health. How do we think about using Medicaid resources to provide non-medical supports for families, looking at things like housing and food and transportation issues for individuals experiencing complex needs? And how could we look at improving not only individual, but also community? So really important to keep an eye on these states and others and think about ways that Medicaid waivers can be leveraged to think about social determinants of health and improving population health outcomes more broadly. Childcare, we talked earlier about how what we see when childcare access is reduced. Pools and colleagues took a look at what might happen if the childcare investments that were included in the Build Back Better plan were implemented. And their modeling showed that those types of investments would be associated with a greater than 6% reduction in CPS investigations, a 6% reduction in substantiated maltreatment, a greater than 3% reduction in foster care placements, and a greater than 11%, almost a 12% reduction in child fatalities due to maltreatment. Yang and colleagues found that for each additional month that mothers who were low income received a child care subsidy, they experienced a 16% decrease in the odds of experiencing another neglect report and a 14% decrease in the odds of a physical abuse report when looking at the 12 months following receipt of their child care subsidy. New Mexico is an important jurisdiction to lift up, who has a goal of achieving a pre-universal child care system. From 2022 to 2023, childcare is going to be free for most families, including families of 4 earning up to just over $110,000. And they're looking to create a dedicated funding stream for universal preschool and childcare and to bolster home visiting programs for new parents. So it will be interesting to watch and see the results of these really important investments in childcare across the state. Our colleague Ann Farrell and her colleagues in Connecticut saw improvements for families that were facing instability but received a supportive housing program. In this case, that's operationalized as a housing voucher plus some additional case management. In their studies, they found that families that experienced these supportive housing programs saw fewer removals, lower prevalence of substantiated maltreatment, and increased reunification. And I'm starting to speed up a little bit because I know that we're running out of time. So if you hear me pick up the pace a little bit, just trying to move us along. Wisconsin is doing some exciting things to try to address some of these housing issues that families involved with child welfare are experiencing. They've got investing in a new Family Keys pilot program established in 2022, where they're looking to provide short-term housing funds for families who are at risk of family separation because of housing insecurity, as well as the target population of families who are unable to reunify because of inadequate housing. And Wisconsin's investing in short-term housing funds to cover challenges such as hotel costs, short-term rentals, and expenses related to finding and maintaining housing like security deposits, first and last month's rent, application fees, utility costs, etc. addressing food insecurity through policies like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, has the capacity to contribute to reductions in child protective system involvement at the population level. Austin and colleagues, over a period of time between 2006 and 2019, looked at states that chose to adopt the SNAP expansion policies of increasing the limit for eligibility and eliminating the asset test. And they found that adopting those two policies was associated with decreases in the number of CPS investigative reports. On average, we're talking about 9.3 fewer investigative reports per 1,000 child each year. And thinking about the generosity of SNAP policies is important. In the Johnson-Motoyama study, and more also recent in 2022, found that states with more generous SNAP policies experienced large reductions in their CPS reports, fewer substantiated reports, particularly for neglect allegations, and fewer foster care placements. And that is compared to states that opted for less generous SNAP policies over the same time period. So that encourages us to take a look at what does the adoption of SNAP policy look like across the country. And in this slide, we're talking about SNAP policy choices reflected in the blue box, like increasing income limits under broad-based categorical eligibility, or BBCE, excluding legally obligated child support payments from total income, providing transitional SNAP payments for families leaving TANF, and using simplified reporting options for changes in household circumstances. And as you can see in the graphic, over the period of time between 2004 and 2016, we're seeing states progressively choose to implement more generous SNAP policies. Okay, and then lastly, I'll close out looking at family preservation programs that also include a concrete support component. Rosted and colleagues found that families that have open child welfare cases, and in this case, the sample is predominantly families experiencing neglect allegations, who received a home-based services program that included a concrete supports component, were 17% less likely to experience a subsequent child maltreatment report during the first year, compared to families that did not have an economic and concrete supports component as part of their family preservation program. And so I'll conclude by lifting up Kentucky, which has been really thinking about how to invest more in flexible funds for child welfare involved families. And their state fiscal year 2022 budget included $1,000, up to $1,000 in flexible funds for families that are participating in Kentucky's Family Preservation Program, and all of Kentucky's Family First Prevention Services include a flexible funding component. And would love to point to the data that we're showing. Between 2019 and 2023, Kentucky has increased their investment in prevention services by 11, that's not even a number, by 11.4 million. And they've observed a almost $80 million reduction in their out-of-home care costs. So exciting to see where this is going to go over time.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Krista. So as we see Kentucky shifting its ratio of spending from out of home to prevention, it's important to note that really is a policy choice. And we know that the costs of waiting in a reactive system once abuse and neglect have occurred is enormous. The annual costs of child maltreatment in the US are estimated in two different studies. The first, we look at about 80 billion estimate between direct and indirect costs of child maltreatment. And then looking at data from 2015 and this 2018 assessment, looked at economic burden due to substantiated maltreatment and estimated that around 428 billion. And economic burden due to investigated child maltreatment, so a broader group of children than those who are, or a more narrow group, sorry, Actually, no, that's the opposite. A much broader group were investigated compared to those who are substantiated and found about a $2 trillion economic burden. So this is an extraordinarily expensive problem. And getting ahead of it, we've shown through multiple studies is possible. We also know that we're spending directly on administering child welfare about $33 billion in public expenditures by state and local child welfare agencies. And the majority of those dollars are spent on out-of-home placements rather than preventive services. So thinking back to the Kentucky slide, where they're really beginning to think about shifting that ratio between preventive and out-of-home placements. And I'm going to just skip to the last two slides because we really believe that this evidence is actionable, and that it is all of us who can make it actionable. If we come at this from a child and family well-being perspective, where we are making equitable policy program and service design choices, where we are centering the experiences of those who have avoided child protection, who have experienced child protection, and in communities who have been working to strengthen families for many years. We think about this in terms of the intersection between our human service agency partners, between child welfare and TANF, between TANF and child welfare and our broader social safety net, and our macroeconomic policy framework. Those are policy choices that are deserving of our attention in order to ensure that child welfare is using the evidence, is coordinating with other systems, and partnering to redesign this policy framework within child welfare, but more broadly as well. We offer up, in closing, one infographic that tries to take all of the studies that we have shared with you today and put them in one place and help us understand how families who become overloaded or are overloaded can make use of macroeconomic social policies, concrete supports, our public benefit support network, and our broader human services system in order to offload some of this burden. And for families for whom that is not sufficient, who have more complex needs, for whom these resources do not sufficiently buffer their challenges, having available some sort of economic differential response or community pathway and navigation that ensures that they get evidence-based practices that can effectively support their recovery and healing from substance abuse or mental health challenges, address domestic violence in the household, and ensure that economic and concrete supports are paired with those more intensive services to meet needs, so that child protection and foster care truly become a service that is provided only when absolutely necessary to ensure the safety of children and families. So again, we have this slide deck and our reference list for all of the studies that we've shared today available here, and we encourage you to peruse that information, and we'd love to take questions if there are any of interest.
Yeah. Thank you, Claire and Yasmin and Krista. Very, very informative. A lot of good work, and obviously a deep knowledge here. One question that came up was about, in reviewing the data, particularly around childcare, that there was a question posted about what other forms of neglect are there. Was it lack of supervision? Is there data on the types of neglect? Are the increase due to mothers not having childcare?
That's a great question. And Yasmin will drop into the chat a link to an opinion piece that we wrote with Dr. Pulls in pediatrics, a perspective piece, where we tried to lay out what we think might be the mechanistic pathways by which childcare reduces involvement with child welfare. And we actually came up with a number of them. Lack of supervision. So someone has to go to work, or has a commitment, or is otherwise detained for a whole host of reasons, substance abuse, mental health problems, and leaves a child unsupervised. So having ready access to childcare would reduce that lack of supervision. Leaving kids with inappropriate caretakers who are either physically or sexually abusive, or then do not uphold their own child care responsibilities, we think might be mechanistic pathways. We also think the cognitive load, we talked about that in the family stress and in the family investment model, that often when there are so many things to do and you can't get to something, you need childcare, but you can't find it, creates an allostatic load or a cognitive load in a household that creates less nurturing relationships and more conflictual interactions between caregivers and with kids. I'd encourage you to go look at that paper. We try and list out, those are the ones that I remember off the top of my head, but we do think that there are numerous mechanistic pathways for childcare specifically.
Well, thank you, Claire. And just for everyone on, we will make, because there were several links put in by other participants.
Oh, terrific.
We'll make sure that those links are all, put out when we do the video and the recording, so that we'll make sure that we track those links, even by those added by others. John, I know there was another question.
Yeah, thanks, Jeanette. Claire and team, thank you for that very deep presentation, very rich in information. There's a question here about the definitions of neglect and whether there was a deeper dive in your analysis as to the facts of substantiation for neglect. So thinking about different laws and policies, how neglect is interpreted, how might that factor into this analysis around what constitutes neglect and what does not?
I'm going to just get us started and turn it over to Krista, who really is our good thought partner about how states implement policies. But there is wide variability across the country in terms of how neglect is defined. And so researchers are left to use the state definition as it relates to a substantiation. But Krista, you want to talk a little bit, I think, both about the variability and how we're starting to see states make changes in their neglect laws relative to this evidence.
Sure. Right, and I think you lifted up right from the onset. One of the challenges is that we don't have universal definitions of use and neglect, and even within jurisdictions, we can see wide variation in how the definitions that they have are applied, and that is an inherent challenge. I think one thing that's interesting to lift up is how many states are thinking about poverty-related exemptions in their neglect laws. At this time, I don't have the slide open in front of me, but I feel like we've got about half of the jurisdictions have poverty-related exemptions within their neglect laws, about half don't. And it's important to think about how those issues are impacting the safety of a child and having a harm specification lens applied to it. It's not a silver bullet just to include a poverty-related exemption in your neglect law. It's a helpful thing to consider, and then also just to think about what is the impact of the stressors that families are experiencing on the safety and risk of the child, and to do that. And to approach those types of improvements and reforms really, really strategically. But I think we're starting to see more of an appetite toward taking a look at this and thinking about ways to ensure that families aren't experiencing neglect substantiations solely due to reasons of poverty, but that they're really looking at what the impact is on the child. Claire, anything more or different you'd add to that?
Yeah, I think I'll add one thing and then I'll elevate one thing that you said. We're seeing just 3 new examples that I think are worth highlighting. Changes in statute. Washington State, Texas, and Kentucky, all 3 recently updated their neglect statutes, specifically to ensure that families are not coming to the attention, that they're not being substantiated as it relates to poverty. The Kentucky law also includes offering families economic and concrete or other supports as a strategy for ensuring that deeper end involvement with child welfare is not occurring. And I guess the thing that I'll elevate that Krista said, and I'll just say it again, is that as states are beginning to look at this evidence and narrow their definitions of neglect to ensure that poverty is not the issue in front of them, or that it is not, I think Virginia calls it poverty adjacent. I'd call it poverty exacerbating other more complex problems. That doing that without also looking at this evidence and understanding that an expansion or a strategy elsewhere in the system is equally important. If we are solely narrowing without thinking about ensuring that families are getting what they need, we may not be serving children very well. Are there other
Jeanette?
questions or thoughts?
I'm sorry, I was muted and talking.
Oh, okay, terrific.
Krista, follow up. I think you used Kentucky as a prevention initiative, and can you talk a little bit? I mean, this session is about collaboration between TANF and Child Welfare, and about preventative strategies, and that seemed like that was. Can you talk about what instigated that in the state of Kentucky, and how did that come about? Do you know?
Well, I don't know that I could answer that directly, but I can share that it was really exciting to be working in Kentucky in the period of time following the passage of the Family First Prevention Services Act. And I can't say that I had the opportunity to be in the room with some of their child welfare leadership, but 5 or 6 years ago, when they first started to look at what their level of investment was in prevention versus foster care. And lifting up some of that data historically over time, and how eye-opening it was for policymakers and decision makers to recognize the amount of money that was being invested in family separation and foster care, and how comparably little investment was being made on the prevention side. And it became kind of a guiding light in their family first planning to really think about how to invest more in prevention, start thinking about how to flip that ratio. So I could not personally speak to how we got to those state level investments, like in the 2022 state budget, but I can attest that there has been a growing conversation over the last 5-6 years to think intentionally about investing more in prevention as a strategy to combat what they had been experiencing very high rates of child removals and foster care, and trying to bring that down.
Well, with that, I want to echo and thank the speakers. It was chock full of information and wonderful to, as you say, elevate some of the evidence and share it with this audience, who really is a mixed audience of child welfare and TANF. With that, Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you for the final closing comments and present announcement.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. Can we have the new slides? Well, thank you. I know this.
Okay. Sorry, Lisa. We had to switch from sharing the screens.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, Claire, Yasmin, and Krista, for the wonderful information that you shared, and the possibilities or the information about how increasing economic supports can help our children and families and help to keep them safe. We want to announce that OFA is planning another TANF Learning Community, where we invite teams of TANF and Child Welfare or entities to participate in a long-term technical assistance event where we have coaches and peer learning, as well as individual TA. The next learning community will be a TANF and Child Welfare collaboration, looking at preventative strategies focused on family well-being. Next slide. So the focus of this learning community is, again, TANF and Child Welfare, developing preventative strategies focused on families and designing innovative approaches to policy and practice changes. Next slide. And what does a TANF learning community include? Well, again, it's a cohort of up to 10 sites who will be learning from each other, who will also have a coach to help them develop an action plan and begin the first stages of implementation. You will be able to access relevant experience, training, and information to dedicated subject matter experts. The learning communities also have have site visits and site exchanges, as well as conventional meetings. Next slide. So we want you to stay tuned because we will be announcing the TANF Learning Community in June. Next month, what we plan to do is to assemble a cohort of states and tribal entities to just get information about what you're doing and what you would like to hear or participate or learn in a listening session. We will be accepting, we will have an interest webinar in early June to explain the self-nomination process, and the packages will be available later in June, and with information, we will be letting people know if they've been accepted by sometime in July. So stay tuned for more information on our, and please join our peer TA listserv if you're interested in learning more about the learning community, or you can email TANF Learning Community at blhtech.com. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you, everyone.